morning, everybody. Thank you again. This is Warren Rayburn, Mind Systems, and I'll be leading today's discussion. This is part 4 in our Diving into the Cloud 5-part webinar series. This fourth portion of the presentation deals with 5 tips to keeping your data secure in the cloud. We're going to go through some just hard numbers today as far as the real-time effect of this as it pertains to staffing, as it pertains to potential exposure, and that being from an asset perspective, that being from an information management standpoint, among other considerations. So with that said, again, I want to thank everybody for coming today to the bridge and joining us. And with that being the introduction here, I'll go ahead and get started. So a couple quick things before we start, and we're going to do this a little differently than we did the first 3 sessions in that we're trying to shorten the length of the presentation to the extent of getting to some of the more key positional indicators for everybody in the buying space. So what is it exactly that you need to look at? What are the exposure points, et cetera? So one of the things that I wanted to just quickly do before we get started on the first slide here was just run through. There was a survey conducted by the Ponemon Institute back in November of 2013. They surveyed more than 2,000 individuals that hold the responsibility for managing the IT security functions within their organizations, and this was done on an international basis, United States, UK, Germany, Asia Pacific, among other participating areas. But these organizations represented in the study employ anywhere from 100 to 5,000 individuals. And some of the interesting summary takeaway points: 1/3 of the respondents admitted that they weren't certain if a cyber attack had occurred in the past 12 months. So that's an interesting thought in and of itself. Again, what are we doing as a business society to ensure that we are properly monitoring these potential threat points, exposure points, and what, if anything, has transpired? So what are we doing from a monitoring standpoint? 58% of the respondents says management does not see cyber attacks as a significant risk to the organization. So what we're going to provide here today is some statistical details to perhaps reduce that skepticism. And I think part of this conversation has to revolve around the insurance aspect of what this is at the end of the day. Next, respondents estimate that the cost of the disruption in normal operations is much higher than the cost of the damages or theft of IT assets or infrastructure. And we'll get into more of that here as well. So what's the man-hour cost here, production costs, things of that nature. And then lastly, mobile devices and bring your own devices are much more of a security concern than the use of cloud applications and or IT infrastructure services. So again, that's another interesting point here as we talk about more and more access, in the working world with, telecommuters, with folks, for that matter, that are on the road much of the day, the sales portion of your organization, the service portion of your organization, and coming back to highly secure environments, or what should be highly secure environments for data retrieval, order placement, and things of that nature. So it's certainly something that, again, has become more and more prevalent in today's world. So with that being said, the first slide here just focuses on not being a victim yourself. So 76% of organizations have faced a cyber attack in the past year that they know of. So again, we talked about the fact that, 1/3 of respondents to the Ponemon survey weren't sure whether or not they had been a target, but then there's the converse of that, and that's a little over 3/4 of organizations surveyed had faced a cyber attack in the past year that they know of. So interestingly enough, that speaks to the monitoring capabilities, or worst case, an exposure element whereby you've noticed a breach and there's some sort of resulting fraud that takes place. Now this can take place in your data environments. We've all heard the stories about Target, among others. But then also the other piece is to consider your phone system environment. So, even if it's a local PBX, but most importantly within the hosted PBX space, anything and everything where you have a password associated with access to information and potential use of resources or assets, you want to make sure that you lock that down. So that takes us to our first point, and that's being smart about your passwords. So with that being said, there's going to be these other 4 points that we'll cover here momentarily, but the password information in and of itself is interesting. So 91% of passwords are one of the most 1,000 common used. So we talk about, the potential for, a hacker on the data or the voice side to get in. I talked about the voice there a moment ago. More often than not, folks with their voicemail access passwords utilize the last 4 digits of their phone number, utilize the 7 digits of the phone number, or any number of the combinations that you see here, being the top 5 most common passwords of 2013, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, for example, people not wanting to be bothered necessarily with the security piece. So with that said, the other element of this consideration is the fact that you want to have some sort of expiration requirements internally. And again, that goes for voice and data. Every 30 days you refresh the passwords. You're making use of alphanumeric characters and some sort of symbol integration. So again, just an interesting fact there that 91% of those passwords are among the most 1,000 common used, making it very easy for people at the end of the day to get to what they want and to make use of your assets. Don't reuse your passwords. 55% of net users use the same password for most, if not all, websites. So again, we talked about mixing and matching things, letters, symbols, capitalization, but again, the refreshing of those requirements, in a very quick interval. Next, and I think it's something that everybody at some point in their career professionally has been guilty of, but it's interesting that 18% of employees share their passwords with coworkers. Depending on, the endpoints that, be it a master user portal for vendor interfacing or management, more often than not, you find yourself sharing that information with a coworker, and the net gun, it just goes down the lane. So obviously, from a logical perspective, that increases your visibility, increases the potential penetration there, as opposed to diversity. You're now employing singular access points. This part here, your email password being the most important, think about it. Every single interaction nearly that you conduct on a daily basis, being it in a e-commerce environment, being in a vendor management situation, a resource reference, potentially for the Scholastic material or otherwise, all of those passwords are being funneled to a universal email account in most cases. So if, your email account were to be hacked, there's the potential for a wide variety of passwords to be exposed at the end of the day. 34% of web users request to reset a password at least once a month. So again, the rapidity with which this happens, the volume that's there, again, you're going to have to make sure that you're moving that information and ensuring, among other things, that your email account is fully secured and accounted for as well when you're talking about security on the whole. So number 2 is the backup of all your data resources. So this speaks to some of the other portions of the presentation we've had in the first 3 sections of the series. So we talked about secured area networks, we talked about data center and co-location services. And again, those are things that you're going to have to think about. I've mentioned in a couple of the previous sessions as well, a case study, an end user of Line Systems that unfortunately due to Hurricane Sandy lost access to the location for 2 full calendar weeks. The director of IT was overseas at the time. They literally had their business come to a grinding halt for 2 weeks. No sales activity, no inventory management, no asset management of any shape or form. So certainly something that they've had to mitigate with our help by going to a data center model and then pushing out their storage area network needs to a co-location services provider and having that information stored in a virtual environment whereby they have some material available locally and they're backing it up. So in the event of another disaster, they can readily access it. But again, don't rely on just one service. So that's one thing we talked about with these folks is, obviously the co-location is one element of this, but, they are also looking at some different models to also go to the cloud in other areas. So cloud storage solutions, everybody's familiar with Dropbox these days based on the variety of mobile devices that carry that particular software. Windows, Live Dive, Amazon's Cloud Drive, SugarSync, and Mozy are just quite a few of the examples that are out there right now, whereby you don't even have to look at a co-location model necessarily, but you can upload those respective files on a time-scheduled basis or as you see fit in the event of an emergency or otherwise. But the beauty of this, unlike the previous models of tape-driven scenarios and services, is that, again, with any Internet connection, you should hypothetically be able to access that information on demand. And again, speaking of the security piece of this, we talked about bring your own device, we talked about accessibility. So going hand in hand with the backup and the security elements and the storage is the accessibility. So again, making sure that you're fully encrypted, which we'll get in here to in a moment. You're addressing all your regulatory needs, be it PCI if you're in a transactional environment from a business standpoint, HIPAA compliance with medical records, law enforcement, SOX regulations, all of those being a consideration for you. But you certainly don't want to limit yourself to any one particular data backup environment. If you can afford to do so as well, redundancy in the field is also a very nice option to make sure you can get to those materials. And then from a security perspective, making sure that your remote users and in an emergency, all users can access that from a variety of endpoints. Lock down the network. You can do so with IP VPN. You can do so with MPLS. There's a number of different options to ensure the data is securely being transmitted along with your encryption strategy as well. Another thing, pay attention when browsing, very simply put. So some simple rules here to ensure that your usership, so I'm sure quite a few of you on the call today are administrators within your environment, and this is something that, it's kind of just common practice, but something that also certainly needs to be reiterated. Performing due diligence on a website before entering any personal information. We've all heard about the Heartbleed and the OpenSSL opportunities that presented themselves in the last 2 to 3 weeks. From a service provider standpoint, we applied a patch with our unified threat mitigation platform at our core, but we have seen actually in the last 3 to 4 days 6 to 8 occurrences of potential Heartbleed attacks. So again, that was the big news a couple weeks ago. You may have heard about. So obviously you want to check with your carrier on that front to address that concern. But again, on a personal basis and with your users in the office, don't let your business be exposed because of somebody's e-commerce habits or otherwise. Be careful where you log in and be sure you always log off, right? So don't leave any open sessions available for folks to get in and take a look at what you've been doing in the business you've been conducting. Don't save passwords to a computer you normally don't use in the event of a theft, misplacement, or frankly, in today's environment with rotating shifts and other such personnel concerns, you also have people that can obviously take advantage of that access at the end of the day, exposing you personally as well as the company potentially at the end of the day. And lastly, any file that you get from an email perspective that contains an executable, for example, comes from an email address that is otherwise suspect, making sure that your rules are adhered to from an administrative perspective. You're using an email and web security service. That's something that, frankly, at the end of the day is really a prerequisite for anybody. But the beauty of that is, again, you're not maintaining a local firewall. You're not maintaining those rules, that all of those respective patches and rules are maintained at a network level, and all of that material is being quarantined at a network level and not further inhibiting your ability to do business locally or affecting your storage environments or otherwise. On the encryption side, that's one of the things that I had alluded to a moment ago. And, the interesting thing is, I'm going to go back to the Ponemon study as well, but when that same group of 2,000 individuals was questioned as to who determines IT security policies, 31% said no one individual in the organization maintains that. So something to keep in mind if you're in the SMB space for that matter, who is the one that's spearheading those efforts, who's making sure that the environment remains as bulletproof as possible, and that there's the adherence to the rule structures that you need to address that and defining those rule structures. One of the other interesting points from the Ponemon study, before we move on here to this next slide, is that 77% of respondents claimed that a loss or exposure of sensitive information had occurred in the last 12 months. So 77%, breaking that down, 51% had stated that there was a loss or exposure, and 16 were unsure, which is even more troubling in a sense, and not understanding, exactly, what their potential exposure or loss may be. So I found that to be very interesting, honestly. So on the encryption front, 64% of organizations rate data encryption as very effective in protecting them from security threats. So again, in this space, you're going to want to definitely talk to your carrier as far as if you're entertaining a private data solution on the MPLS front, what encryption methodology they employ and support, and also from an internal perspective, how that data is being then transmitted locally to ensure that there's no conflict there. But encryption in and of itself, from a definition standpoint, is the process of encoding information in such a way that only authorized users can read and understand it. In other words, it scrambles and codes your credentials so no one will be able to procure them easily, and it actually dissuades those out there that are phishing to potentially move on to the next target if in fact it's not worth the trouble, and the encryption methodology there is effective. Types of cyber attacks, one of the interesting things I'll go through is the top 5. It's the phishing and social engineering methodology. That's going to be 55%. Next common cyber attack is a denial of service or a botnet, so a DDoS attack where you're actually getting a rapid succession of inquiries to a localized server, or it could be, frankly, a phone system for that matter, and occupying all your resources. Next is advanced malware or zero-day attacks. Fourth was traditional viruses or malware. And then lastly is a compromised device, so somebody that gets into an endpoint device like a laptop or a desktop machine or otherwise. So there's security packages out there today that not only encompass email and web security that you can subscribe to and create more of an OpEx model, but you can get into endpoint device management. We have a large educational association that has anywhere from 80 to 500 alien devices on campus at any one time. So wireless defense is certainly a major concern for them, and we've been able to address that need. So certainly something to keep in mind, and those 5 are an indicator of what's out there and what's potentially waiting for you. So next, we wanted to talk lastly about the antivirus and anti-spy software. And the next slide here just reads that all access to the cloud is from your system. So if your system's at risk, then your online data is at risk. So again, just reinforcing the need to sanctify the environment locally to eliminate any potential penetration points, and understand that when you start to move this data out to a co-location environment or out to a partner such as a Microsoft or otherwise, you have, again, as that information is being transmitted, you have to keep in mind that it's exposed on the public internet, hypothetically, or, otherwise, with bring your own devices and things of that sort. So certainly something to keep in mind as you move forward. And, again, there's a variety of different ways to do this. We mentioned the subscription methodology with a provider. We've also talked about, potential CapEx models whereby you can employ local devices to address that. Cisco platforms, Sophos platforms, so on and so forth. So lastly, I was going to end with the important security technologies to detect or block cyber attacks. So we've talked about antivirus here today, right? So that was just that last slide, making sure that perhaps, there's the cloud option, or leading us into the second one, which would be a client firewall environment. There's also endpoint management, and as we talked about, ensuring that again, all of those potential threat points are addressed. You're talking about laptops, desktops, your wireless devices that are on your network at any one time. You're also talking about servers, talking about routers that you have locally as well. The encryption technologies, we can certainly get into further details offline about this, but again, a very critical question to ask your carrier as far as your encryption requirements and whether they're being honored all the way through the connection. Secure web gateways. The final 3 here, identity and access management. We talked about password management here today. We talked about device management. Next generation firewalls. So again, talking to cloud-based models, talking to higher-end firewalls with greater capacity. And lastly, network traffic intelligence. Again, that's the monitoring piece of this. You want to be in a situation where if you move to the cloud for your security needs, that you have the ability to blacklist and whitelist potential environments that could expose you on a variety of levels. You also want to see utilization reports. You want to see if, again, there's anything happening after hours where you might be out of the office, and these folks are obviously going to time those attacks whereby they're not as noticeable. I can tell you firsthand on the phone fraud side that I would say 95% of what we see transpires anywhere from 11 p.m. in the evening through the next morning at 5 a.m., and that's just simply because nobody's there to see that the lines are occupied. Well, the same thing's going to go for your data traffic. Obviously, nobody's complaining about latency trying to get to a particular application, software, or website, as they're simply not in the office. So with that being said, I wanted to thank you first and foremost again for attending this 4th installment of the series. I wanted to open up the bridge for any potential questions.
All guests are no longer muted.
Well, what we'll do is my information is available here. We'll just go ahead and open it up offline later. You can always email me, and we can converse if you have something specific about an application or concerns you have about your environment. We'd certainly be happy to help. So the last portion of this 5-part series, Show Me the Money, 10 Reasons Why Cloud Computing is a Cost-Effective Solution. It's a nice way to really kind of bring this whole thing full circle. You know, a lot of folks are hesitant because of the, the financial implications this carries. And I mentioned the insurance angle on this previously. You know, that's something that, you know, the diversity within the cloud offerings that are available, you know, even down to, storage and down to, response times and turn-up times, you can manipulate things such that, it doesn't hurt to always ask the question. And that's our point in all of this is, as the industry moves more in this direction and you see more and more of this in the public marketing space and advertising space for that matter, about security as a service and about the potential threats that are out there, ask the questions and get out there and find out, who can help you best. It may be a smaller scale situation like an Amazon, as I mentioned, or Microsoft with an Office 365 component. Something like that, but ultimately getting to the point whereby you have your financial regulatory, and day-to-day business procedures and functionality accounted for. So with that being said, again, I hope to see you guys again on May 29th at 1 o'clock. We'll kick that off. And again, my sincere thanks for attending today.